Hey guys, my name is Dasha and I want to tell you about 10 books that influenced me when I was younger. And book number 1 is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I read this book when I was 11 years old. I was watching the TV series Scarlett with Timothy Dalton and Joanne Whalley. And my mom said that there is a book actually about Scarlett, so I started reading the book. And that was the first book I've read that showed me that main characters are not always good people. And I mean, I loved Scarlett a lot. She was smart and powerful and willful and amazing, but sometimes she was obviously an ass, especially to Melanie. And even being an 11-year-old, I could understand sometimes that this is not how good people should act. And there was actually one more lesson, now that I think of it, that I did not learn because I was 11. And the lesson was that just because you're in love with the guy doesn't mean that he's good for you. Because these things just come and go. And of course I had to later have the experience of my own of this kind. But that's actually one of the lessons of this novel. And since I'm talking about this book, I could also say that I love the Alexandra Ripley's Scarlett more than Margaret Mitchell's Scarlett. For those of you who maybe don't know, there is Gone with the Wind, the original novel by Margaret Mitchell, that was not really finished because Margaret Mitchell died. And Gone with the Wind doesn't really have a happy ending. And there is a separate author, Alexandra Ripley, who decided to create this happy ending for the main characters, and she wrote a separate book called Scarlett. But since these two books have different authors, they have different Scarletts. And Scarlett that Alexandra Ripley created is wiser, older, and kinder, I guess. So I could say that I liked her more back then, and I would still say that I like Alexandra Ripley's Scarlett more. The second book I want to tell you about is 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. And that book taught me that even if I consider some person smart, it doesn't mean that I need to read whatever they advise to read. Back at the university, there was this guy that I liked, and we had pretty cool conversations, and I thought he's so smart and intelligent and awesome. We started discussing books, and I realized that we have totally different tastes. But I thought that he must be reading something pretty cool, and if I read something what he reads, maybe I would become a little bit cooler myself. So I asked him, what is one book that you would like me to read? And he named this book, The 20th Century Ghosts. This was just terrible. I did not like it. I read like half of the book and I stopped reading, and I also stopped liking that guy that much because I couldn't understand who read this stuff. And I don't say that it's a bad book, but have you read it? Seriously? If you like this genre, okay. But I was reading contemporary, I was reading love stories, I was reading something kind, I was reading Louise Hay and stuff about positive thinking. And I honestly thought back then that Joe Hill must be on drugs if he writes this stuff. And that book taught me a precious lesson. I don't need to read or watch the stuff that I don't want to read or watch just because somebody tells me,
read this, it's awesome, oh, you gotta watch this movie because it's so brilliant.
If I didn't like the annotation and if I don't like this genre, I don't have to read this stuff. The third book is Bridget Jones's Diary. This book, well, actually 3 books, well, okay, 2, because the third one was published much later. These 2 books made me fall in love with keeping diaries. The style of Bridget Jones's diaries is so cool and so natural that you just want to also write all the time. I have been keeping diaries since I was 14, and it's probably because back in my childhood I had a favorite book, a Russian book about a dog who kept a diary. And so I started keeping diaries too, and it has been a hobby of mine ever since. But every time I read Bridget Jones's Diary, and I read the first book 4 times, and the second book maybe 3 or 2 times, it made me fall in love with journaling again. Although now my diary looks a little bit different, I have 3 blocks, and the first one is for 10 things that I'm grateful for. Well, actually 10 to 20 that I write down every day. And I'm pretty sure you've heard about this exercise, but it actually works. And if you write 20 things that you're grateful for every day, it physically makes you warm here inside, and it just makes you happy. The second block of my diary I use for the exercises from self-help books and motivational books, because I really like not just reading them but also doing the exercises, so I have a separate block of my diary for that. And the third part of my diary is just for that kind of journaling, like in Bridget Jones's diary. I can talk about the weather and complain about the weather. I can just tell how my day goes and what I discussed with whom and what conclusions I made, and just whine a little bit and tell about stuff that made me happy or mad or whatever. Journaling is pretty cool, you should try that. The fourth book and also the fifth and the sixth ones are by Sophie Kinsella, and these are 20th Girl, I've Got Your Number, and Can You Keep a Secret. They're typical chick lit love stories, and what I loved about those books was that the main characters were so real, ordinary girls, and so close to me, I would say, with their flaws, with their positive and negative traits, that I felt somehow connected with them. And sometimes they were silly and they did not accept some stuff about themselves, and they found themselves in weird situations often. But since these are love stories, and in the end those girls would find perfect boyfriends who would accept them for who they were, I kind of also learned to accept those things about me, that I sometimes can be silly and weird, but also lovable and likable. That I learned sometimes at weird situations, look at myself through Sophie Kinsella's eyes, I would say. And it helped me because I guess I started reading those books at the right time when I was like 21 to 24. And it helped me at that age not to be too cruel to myself, to feel good about myself and not to waste precious energy and time on trying to be perfect all the time. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about non-fiction. The seventh and the eighth book I would like to mention are 33 Strategies of War and 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. I used to talk a lot about those two books on my streams, and I mentioned them every time somebody asked me what books I would advise everyone to read. I think those books are must-reads. Those books taught me a lot about people. I started reading 48 Laws of Power when I got my first job at the office. Maybe because I was young and didn't have the experience of working in the office before with all this office politics, but I was constantly angry with everyone. I thought everyone was evil and everyone hated me. And 48 Laws of Power helped me to understand some stuff and understand people and why are they acting like this and what are they trying to achieve, and that it's not about me but about them. And I used 33 Strategies of War for 2 years that I worked at my last job in the office because I had a hard time dealing with the manager. And that book helped me a lot. This is how I would advise you to read these books, not from the beginning to the end. Open the table of content, find the lessons that you think describe your situation, maybe like 3 or 2 or 5, and read them. And I'm pretty sure you will get the solution. You will understand things and people. What do they do? Why are they doing this? What are their motives? What are they trying to achieve? Those books are very useful. And still, every time I have some situations with other people that I find unsolvable, I get back to those books. I find lessons that describe my situation and I start understanding people and situations better, and I find ways out. The next book I want to mention is You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. I started reading this book when I was young, maybe 18 or 17 years old, and the main thing that I understood from that book was the power of affirmations. And nowadays it's not very popular to support the idea of positive affirmations, and you can see a lot of stuff on the internet like
A happy person doesn't need to stand in front of the mirror repeating to themselves that they are happy.
This is not how the affirmations work. It's not about just going around and lying to yourself, I'm happy, and I'm happy when you're not happy. Affirmations actually are things that you keep repeating to yourself in your mind all the time. Like, I suck, and I can't do this, and I won't ever succeed in this, why even bother, and stuff like this. And when you read this book, you start observing and noticing how much terrible things you actually tell yourself on a daily basis, and you start telling yourself good things instead. And again, not just lying to yourself, but finding good stuff to concentrate on instead of I suck, for example. Finding stuff that you're good at, like I'm sociable and I know how to make people feel better and people love me for that. You just start concentrating on different things and feeling good. And feeling good every day, by the way, is already a life changer. Because when you feel positive, you want to do stuff instead of just sitting on the couch and complaining. And that book helped me to realize that. And maybe it didn't always work, but once in a while I would remember about this and act on it and change something. It was very useful for me as a teenager. And the last book I'm going to mention is Awaken, the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. I remember I really liked the idea that we do everything either out of fear or out of love, and whatever people do can be explained by them either being happy and in love and kind or being scared. And I know how people feel about those motivational books and self-help books, but I believe that these things actually work. And one of the main precious lessons that I got from the Awaken the Giant Within book is that I worked on it for some time and I remembered how I felt. I felt active, I felt alive, I felt responsible for what's happening in my life. And I felt like I want to do something, to change stuff, to make my life better, instead of just, sitting and whining. And every time I found myself depressed or upset or frustrated, at some point I would just remember how I felt while reading self-help books. And I just thought that I wanted to feel like that again, because in that condition, I wanted to actually do something. And if this is like the only thing that I would get from those self-help books, it's already good enough. Although I strongly believe that self-help literature is very powerful when you work on it, when you don't just read one book and expect a life-changing experience, but when you read those books regularly and listen to audiobooks and do the exercise that they ask you to do for at least a year, you will definitely change stuff in your life. I'm getting emotional, but it's just because I really do believe these things work. Anyway, these were 10 books that made an impact on me when I was younger, and thank you for listening, and see you next time.
And that the chemistry